Tonight on Primetime Politics, a multi-billion-dollar contract for Boeing.
This was in Canada's national interest to make this decision.
Ottawa chooses the U.S. aerospace company to supply Canada with new surveillance planes, but did so without entertaining any other bids, including one from Bombardier. Why wasn't a Canadian alternative considered? We'll speak with Defence Minister Bill Blair. And
those local media outlets will receive very little and possibly nothing at all. This bill has killed them.
did Ottawa give in to Google? Why is the tech company's payment threshold much lower than expected? We will speak with the Heritage Minister, Pascale St-Onge. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. After much speculation, Ottawa made it official today, signing a contract to acquire up to 16 P-8A Poseidon aircraft to replace Canada's aging Aurora surveillance planes. Now, the contract is worth over $10 billion, but it is coming under scrutiny for being sole-sourced and for choosing an American maker without investigating a Canadian alternative.
There's a high degree of uncertainty around cost, around schedule of delivery, and ultimately about operational effectiveness. The certainty of this platform, because it is in use among our allies, and the fact that it met all of the requirements that the Air Force defined for us, really made this not only the right choice, but frankly the only choice.
Well, of course, that was the Defence Minister you just heard, and Bill Blair joins us right now on the program. Minister, thank you for joining us.
Of course, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin with some reaction here to your decision with the P-8 Poseidon, a uniform which, as you know, represents many of this country's aerospace workers. They're criticizing what essentially was this sole source procurement process, and they say by not considering a Canadian alternative, your government is doing great harm to workers in this country. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I would just simply remind them, first of all, when we entered into this agreement to purchase the P-8, we have negotiated a pretty significant investment benefits package for the country, which will result in billions of dollars being invested in Canadian industry. It's going to create as many as 3,000 jobs right across Canada, and additionally, it's going to add about $358 million to our gross domestic product. These are pretty significant benefits. And as well, I would just also simply point out to them, these are benefits that will begin almost immediately because this is a plane that's already, it has these capabilities and it's in production. Every other alternative that we looked at was a development proposal rather than a plane. There was only one plane that met the capability requirements of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and that was the Poseidon, and so that's the one we went with. And in purchasing that, those benefits will begin almost immediately. The alternative was filled with uncertainty because, you know, when a development project, it does require a long time to go through a different type of procurement process. It also requires time in development well before production could possibly begin. And as a consequence, there's a lot of uncertainty around schedules and capability and cost. And so my responsibility is to get the Canadian Air Force what they need, and this is what they said they needed. And so we've delivered that. But I would want to assure the workers at Unifor, we care very much about Canadian workers, and this is going to actually secure about 3,000 Canadian jobs. Okay,
3,000 Canadian jobs. I hear what you're saying, but how do you address the concerns that were brought up by the Quebec government, by the Ontario government, the Bloc Québécois today in the House, basically saying that you're ignoring the workers and Bombardier, Canadian Quebec company, with this choice?
I would want to assure them that that's simply not true. First of all, we looked at, there are also workers in the Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Canadian Air Force. We wanted to make sure that we delivered the capability that they required. That not only did we provide them with a platform, the plane, that they needed to do their job, but it was a safer plane. It has much greater capability in doing the job. It'll make them more effective, but it'll also help them keep them safe while they're doing the job. And at the same time, there's a very real difference between we looked at, in the national interest, we believed that we needed to meet those capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces as quickly as possible. There was only one option available to us. There was only one plane that met those requirements. That was the Poseidon P-8. And there were many other companies that had proposed a development option, They didn't have a plane that met those requirements, but they had an interest in developing them. And so if we'd gone in, there was no guarantee that any company would have been successful in that procurement process. And I think a lot of people have made an assumption that it was a competition between, two companies as opposed to many. But the reality was there was one plane that met the requirements. That's the plane that we bought because that's the plane we need right now. And it had those requirements. I have great confidence in Canadian aeronautic industry. There are some really great companies out there, but they did not have a plane that met these requirements. And unfortunately, right now, we needed that plane.
Okay, you keep referencing the requirements, Minister. Walk us through exactly what were you looking for? What does this plane need to achieve?
Yeah, there are a number of things. We use that plane primarily, the best way to describe it is a submarine hunter. And so it had to be able to have the equipment, the new modern equipment, the new technology that enables them to do that. There are also other requirements with respect to, it's primarily around defense and lethality, as well as the capability of holding a significant payload in order to carry the electronic equipment that is necessary to do that increasingly difficult job. I'll also tell you that the Air Force has told us very clearly that submarine detection and hunting and tracking, which is their primary mission, has become increasingly difficult because some of our air adversaries have been significantly changing the threat environment and investing in greater stealth and persistence and lethality in their submarines. Those planes are also used for search and rescue. They have a number of other, very significant requirements. The Canadian Armed Forces defined that for us, and we went looking to what was available and what could be made available to deliver on that. And frankly, there was only one option. It was not only the right choice, it was the only choice. And that was the Poseidon P-8. And so that's why we made that decision to purchase that plane. And because it answered the requirements, as I've said a number of times, of the Air Force. And it was the only one that did that.
Okay, the only choice, but it was also clearly Washington's choice. Does that create any optical issue for your government? No,
I would hope not, because frankly, I want to be really clear, this was Canada's choice. Canada began looking at this in 2017. The then Defense Minister, Minister Sajjan, began an initiative under the Strong, Secure and Engaged Defense Policy to begin looking at the replacement of the CP-140. There has been a lot of work done over the last couple of years and by my immediate predecessor, Minister Anne, to try to find if there were any alternatives that met the requirements of the armed forces. There are, I think, real advantages, by the way, in this particular model because it is being used by all of our Five Eyes partners. It's used by not just by the United States, but by the United Kingdom, by Australia, by New Zealand, and a number of our NATO European allies as well. And so that interoperability, and to some extent even interchangeability on those planes actually makes it safer and more effective for our people. But the decision to make this choice, the decision about this plane, we had to ask the U.S. government if they would consider selling us this plane, but the decision to purchase it was made entirely in Canada in consideration of Canada's best interest. I believe that this is in the best interest of our Air Force. It's in the best interest of Canadians. This is going to help our people do the important job of keeping our country safe, to support and extend Arctic sovereignty, to hold up our responsibilities to NATO, to NORAD, and in the Indo-Pacific. It's a safer platform for our people than the one they currently work on. It's going to enable them to do the job.
Mm-hmm. Procurement, of course, as you know very well, been an issue in this country, continues to be an issue with this country. So talk to us a bit about the time frame here, because the option is upwards of 16 Poseidons. But how quickly are we going to see this? How quickly will they be in service in this country?
Yeah, the first ones will be delivered within 2 years. We already have the opportunity to train our crews on some of our allies' planes. As a matter of fact, I had 4 of our Air Force aviators in the room today at our press conference announcing this, all of whom fly in the 140s, one of whom is actually already trained on the P-8. And so we'll begin training our crews because, and I think it'll be a fairly easy transition for them because our people are exceptionally well trained and very adaptable to the new environment. But at the same time, we expect to see the first of these planes delivered within 2 years and all of them delivered by 2028. That's very significant because it's going to enable us to manage an effective transition between the CP-140 and the P-8 plane. We're going to have to continue to maintain those 140s. They'll remain in service until replaced by the P-8. But that transition now, we have a very clear schedule on when those planes will be delivered, and that certainty is going to be very helpful to the RCAF in determining when to train their people and some of the transition and infrastructure that we're going to have to put in place in both Greenwood, Nova Scotia, and Comox, BC. This is where these planes are going to be based. We've got some work to do in those places to support the new fleet, and so that work can proceed, and we've got a pretty certain schedule about when these deliveries will be able to take place.
Minister Bill Blair, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Yeah, of course, Michael. Have a good day.
You too. Well, let's continue the conversation now. Joining us is our weekly political panel, Susan Smith, Principal with the Blue Sky Strategy Group, Tim Powers, Chairman of SUMA Strategies, and Anne McGrath, the NDP's National Director. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Welcome.
So here, let's start here with Boeing, because here we have this multi-billion-dollar contract being awarded to an American company, not considering a Canadian alternative. Is that a mistake? I'll ask you to start us off.
It's a more than a simple question like that, Michael. The issue is it's 50. We have to replace planes that are 50 years old. We have to do it reasonably quickly, and we have to look at what our partners are doing as well. So when you look at the life, what's left in the service life of the planes that are there, they're going to be done in 6 years. So can we get a brand new aircraft that's never been tested, that's built to spec, on time, on budget, given the history of our procurement system? I would submit best efforts have never yielded that. So I think what the government did was make a prudent decision. They need surveillance aircraft. Our allies use the similar aircraft, and it's the fastest way to get new equipment to our people. But the other side is there'll be investment from the company into the Canadian economy.
Yeah, which is the argument that we're hearing. Although we've heard from unions, we heard from Unifor, as well as aerospace unions, machinist unions. They wanted a Canadian alternative, and they say this is a huge opportunity missed. What do you say, Dan?
Well, and I think that there was it's been headed in this direction for some time, and maybe they should have ripped this bandage off earlier and actually done what they looked like they were going to do anyway. But I think that in particular Unifor and the other unions, they have a point. And the other thing about this is that, you know, there's that whole old saying about in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. There are a lot of explanations about, you know, it may be that that's what they had to do, but when you have to explain that much about the jobs, the Canadian companies, the geography, all of the things that go into that, I think you got a problem.
And Tim, and I'm asking you last because you have a dog in the fight on this one. What do you say?
Well, yeah, to your
flies.
lead in, yes, SUMA represents Boeing, so obviously I have a little bit of a conflict here. I would say a few things. I'd pick up on something Susan said. I don't think we know what a good procurement process is in Canada, and that's not a political comment, that different governments have tried different things, and we're still trying to find one. So I guess judgment on this one will be determined after the fact. On the aging fleet and the fleet that doesn't work, I think, as we have seen, the need was probably now rather than later. So they're buying now. They're going to spend $9 billion now, they being the government of Canada, rather than waiting to see what the price may be for an aircraft that isn't used by our Five Eyes partners. This is used by the other Five Eyes partners. And I'd say, look, and Anne makes a fair point about unions and Bombardier and the governments of Quebec and Ontario, but there's nothing preventing those governments and in turn helping those unions by buying water bombers, as these things are, for their own provinces too. Every province tends to have a fleet of these of water bombers, or a couple water bombers. That can be done there if there's concern about that. The last thing I'd say, and this is not a shot at Bombardier, but their product is developmental at this stage. There's nothing preventing them from bringing this on stream later on or fulfilling provincial needs as they exist.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, but you know, given the number of interested parties here, will there be a political price for going sole sourced here?
I think there'll be some noise. There's no question. I mean, the premiers of Quebec and Ontario will have to make some noise. I think the long-term play, though, is how quickly can we actually get planes? How quickly can they help the military? How quickly can they do the jobs that they're supposed to do? I do expect a bit of noise at the beginning, but in the end, there will be investment in the Canadian economy. And most importantly, the military will get the kit that it needs. The Air Force will get the planes that it needs to replace 50-year-old aircraft.
You're nodding very strongly there.
Well, again, obviously, we work with Boeing, but look, Bombardier is a company that's well invested in by the government of Canada. I think they're going to continue to grow as an enterprise. So today's disappointment for them will probably not last that long. And again, the governments of Quebec and Ontario have other aircraft options they can purchase for their own particular needs, though, albeit this is a surveillance aircraft. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of noise, but it'll ultimately be judged on its effectiveness, I think.
Anne?
There will definitely be a political price, and it won't be just on this. It's the accumulation. Like it adds to other things, right? So in Quebec and Ontario, there is often a perception that these things don't benefit the people in these provinces. There is a perception that unions aren't consulted enough, and that union advice isn't taken, and those kinds of things. So this particular thing isn't the issue. It's the accumulation of other types of situations like this, and those things add up, and there is a price to pay.
Well, speaking of things that potentially adds up, I also want to talk about another government contract, the battery plant being built by Stellantis and LG. Of course, billions of dollars from the federal government, Canadian taxpayer money going towards this project. And then essentially this disclosure that there will be a few hundred, I think 900 total foreign workers that will be fitting this plant. How problematic is that for the government? How should they react to this bit of news, do you think?
Well, I think the government of Ontario and the government of Canada are closely watching this. The net new jobs for the Stellantis plant will be 2,500 brand new jobs, and we will end up with a new battery plant, EV battery plant that will, be in place for many, many years. I think it was a surprise that the Korean company is going to be bringing in some Korean workers to help stand up the operation, though when you do some reading and you do some digging, it's not quite as dramatic as people are saying. And I think there's a little bit to be expected with proprietary technology that's going to be stood up. I don't know if the numbers need to be as big as they are. I expect Minister Boissonnault to be looking at the labor market impact assessment, the applications to bring in to make sure. He will look very closely to make sure that there isn't a Canadian worker that can do the work. But I don't think it was quite as dramatic as has being said. It's caused some eyebrows to be raised, definitely, but I think the long term is 2,500 new jobs for Canada as soon as this place gets up and moving.
Tim?
Hard to point to an industry in Canada right now that doesn't have foreign workers. So, I mean, this stuff gets blown out of proportion. Obviously, the preference is, I think, for all governments and businesses to have Canadians take the jobs immediately, but that isn't often the case. I mean, this becomes a convenient political argument when the reality is our demography is a challenge, our upskilling takes time. I think you have to judge this over time, not on the immediate number of foreign workers that are coming in.
Anne?
So this is a really big project for southwestern Ontario. We were talking earlier about the Bombardier and regionalism and all of that kind of thing. This is very important for southwestern Ontario, and I think there's a lot of support for it from a number of perspectives. I think, to go to the point of the others, the key thing here is that it was a surprise. I mean, there was a lot of support for it, both from the environmental, the value of EV vehicles and those kinds of things, but very importantly, the jobs. And I think that it was sold on the basis of well-paid, unionized Canadian jobs. And so I don't think people were expecting this story. So while I think that there's, certainly, you can hear the rationale and all of those kinds of things, that there should be fewer and fewer surprises like this.
Absolutely, which we've heard a little bit about looking more deeply into it. But before we're completely out of time this week, I also want to talk about Danielle Smith, because without a doubt grabbed headlines as the week started when she invoked the Sovereignty Act. What's your reaction to that?
I think that's precisely what Danielle Smith wants to do with the Sovereignty Act, and I think in the end and that's what it's about. This is a dangerous piece of legislation in my view, where a minister or the Premier of Alberta, if they get a thorn in their shoe or a thorn in their side, they can introduce a motion, and if it gets passed, then it goes through several steps before there's challenges. But it's step one is all that they really care about. They want the news, they want the headlines every time they do this. And I think the bottom line will be a net negative effect to Alberta. It's going to destabilize investor confidence in the province. And it really it's like a, I don't know, a punch in the nose to our legal system and our democracy and our constitution, our laws. You can't just every time you have a hissy fit decide you're going to override things. Canadians aren't comfortable with that. It makes people uncertain. But I think in the end, it's going to be a problem for investment in Alberta. People are going to look to go to more stable jurisdictions.
Okay. Yeah, if it isn't more than a show pony, and I think to Susan's point, she often turns the issue of the Sovereignty Act into a show pony. But what else did she do this week? She was hugging Francois Philippe Champagne. Why? Big investment in Alberta that's going to benefit Alberta and Canada. So if you want to be sovereign on one side and you don't want to, then don't take their money on the other side. So I mean, the reality is that wherever the check's coming from, I think any premier, be it Danielle Smith or anybody else, will find a way to have an accord. And when you want political distance, sometimes you pick a fight.
Yeah, and that's a proud daughter of Alberta.
Yes, this is Danielle Smith's own personal weapon that she's going to just use whenever she feels that it'll be politically advantageous for her, and that's what she's doing here. You know, I think it's ridiculous. It makes no sense. It is just like a pet peeve kind of thing, and you know, it goes back to the days of the firewall letter that people know about that was drafted, and you know, I think that she thinks that the people of Alberta are, I don't know what her perception is of the people of Alberta, that they want to always fight with Ottawa. Certainly, it's advantageous from time to time to pick a fight with Ottawa, but pick it over something that is really substantial and that people get. And I think that the problem with some of the things that she's using right now, whether it's the Sovereignty Act or any of the other things that she's talking about, like the Alberta pension plan, these are not things that the citizens of Alberta are clamoring for. So I think that she's making some politically unstrategic moves.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. Glad to get your reaction on all of that. So Susan, Tim, and have a great weekend, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Heritage Minister was asked some tough questions today. Pascale St-Onge appearing before committee to explain the deal she and her government reached with Google. Yesterday, it was announced the tech giant has agreed to pay media firms for content that appears on its search engine, an important development as Ottawa's Online News Act comes into effect next month. But the dollar figure is far less than Canadian officials were expecting.
The deal that was entered into yesterday between Google and the government would actually appear to show that Google forced the hand of the government. Google got everything it wanted. $100 million spent, one agreement, and one collective chosen by Google on their terms. And so it's clear then that big tech is actually in the driver's seat.
Well, joining us now is Canada's Minister of Heritage, Pascale St-Onge. Minister, thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, I want to begin here with the financial contribution, because what Google will make under this deal, or give under this deal, is basically 41% lower than what Canadian officials said should be Google's monetary threshold. Are you disappointed by the $100 million in any way?
No, not at all, because there was a lot of numbers that were floated during the last year while this law was being discussed. However, you know, even in all the other agreements that Google might have around the world, it's never clear how much there is in those agreements when it comes to the monetary aspect and the non-monetary aspect. So what we've secured is $100 million per year, which will be indexed to inflation. And Google will continue to provide other services to our news outlets everywhere in Canada. So it's more valuable than just $100 million. But in the agreement, we wanted to make sure that we secured the monetary part of of this.
Okay, so more than just the $100 million, as you say, because there will be contributions in kind, I guess is the best way to put it. But talk to us about the importance of setting this precedent, because Google was the one company that stayed in discussions with the government as Meta pulled out.
Well, it's extremely important because, you know, one of the things that was said about the Australian agreement, and our legislation is based a little bit on the Australian model, is that the deals were struck behind closed doors. So nobody knows exactly how much Google is paying to the news outlets, and neither do we know how many news outlets are actually receiving contribution. In Canada, we chose a legislation, we chose transparency, and we chose to make sure that not only the big news outlets would have access to this deal with Google, but that also would be included at the table of discussion local media, smaller media, independent media, indigenous media, medias of official languages in minority situations. So transparency was really important to us.
Mm-hmm. So transparency as well as the money. What impact do you hope this money will actually have on the media landscape in this country?
Well, this is an additional piece of the puzzle. We know that the media has been through a big crisis over the last decade because of the disruption in the market brought by those super powerful tech giants. This is a piece of the puzzle to reestablish a little bit more balance between those digital platforms and the news sector, which is vital to democracy. So it's not going to solve everything, but this is $100 million of new dollars that will be injected in the news sector in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you know, a lot of questions are being asked right now as to how much money the CBC Radio-Canada will actually get out of that $100 million. How much of an issue is that for you? How will that actually be addressed?
Well, I think it's important that we don't discriminate the type of information and its value when it comes to digital platform. I think the news provided by our public broadcaster has value and should be recognized by Google. However, I do know that the sector is having a lot of difficulty. I do know that the public broadcaster has strong public support. So we will balance that out, and everything will be made clear in the final regulations that will come out shortly before the law is enacted on December 19th.
Okay, so we'll look for details before December 19th, as you say. One last word from you, and this is more of I guess, a philosophical thought, because as I stated, Google stayed in there, negotiated with the Canadian government. Meta did not. What does that say about a company's social responsibility to be a good corporate citizen?
It says a lot. It says that Meta refuses to follow government legislation, which is a huge problem. It also shows that Meta is choosing to leave its platform basically to disinformation and misinformation, because we know that the best way to fight against this is to have journalists that cover the news and that is based on facts. Now, by preventing Canadians to share important news to family and friends, they're actually, in my opinion, leaving their platform to really only disinformation. And this is a tendency that we see here in Canada, but Facebook is doing the same thing all over the world, slowly cutting access to news. We saw that in Europe. They took off the news tab. And in the United States, there's less and less access to news. So this is extremely worrisome, and I'm wondering what Zuckerberg is doing here.
Okay. Well, Minister, I appreciate the time today. Thank you for it.
Thank you for having me. Have a good weekend.
You too. And that is our program for this Thursday evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching Primetime Politics. We'll be back tomorrow, but up next, Esther Bégin avec l'essentiel.